Hi, this is going to be the last video, so I'm glad that you've come this far, and I do think that it's going to be well worth your time when it comes to writing paper one. Thus far, we've talked about how Upton Sinclair believes that freedom was limited in America throughout the Gilded Age. And we've seen that in Sinclair through the working conditions, the conditions under which people like Jurgis work are not only very dangerous and pay very little, but they don't lend themselves very well to saving or investing or a better life for you or your children. We've talked about how the living conditions were oppressive, to say the least. We've talked about the dangers of working and living in Packingtown, and you should also understand that by reading in your big blue book, your Documents for America's History, that this wasn't simply relegated to Chicago, or any city for that matter. Most urban areas were dangerous places to live. What I want to talk about in this last segment is why all of this is tolerated, how all of this is tolerated. As you go through the jungle, ask yourself, where is the government? In this day and age, we have an active government, and I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm simply saying that it's active. That would have been unrecognizable to Americans in the late 19th century. Government was small, and it was supposed to be small. That's how most people looked at the world. That was a good thing. Anyway, because the government was small and very unintrusive in the lives of people like Jurgis Rudkis, but also people like Andrew Carnegie, there were problems that went on unaddressed, or as I like to see it, there was no referee that made people play by the rules. I want to give you a couple examples from the jungle in which you don't have any government, and more importantly, the government really isn't working for the best interest of the people. In other words, working class people like Jurgis Rudkis. If you've got your book with you, I want you to flip it to chapter 9, and then turn to page 85. The first full paragraph on page 85 begins with, "And now in the Union, Jurgis." Find that part. And now, in the Union, Jurgis met men who explained all this mystery to him, and he learned that America differed from Russia in that its government existed under the dead forms of democracy. The officials who ruled it and got all the graft had to be elected first, and so there were two rival sets of grafters known as political parties, and the one that got the office which bought the most votes. This is really going to set the tone for the rest of our discussion here with political corruption, because the government is essentially for sale during this time period. And we've seen that in various instances in our class. I'll give you a few examples when we get closer to ending this segment. But what I'd like you to understand right now is that in Upton Sinclair's book, you can see time after time after time, the government really isn't enforcing the laws for the interest of the people. It's passing laws or looking the other way in a lot of instances, because the big producers, including the meat packers, see it as more beneficial in that capacity. I want to give you a few more examples of exactly what it is that I mean when it comes for the government working for the special interests, the corporations, and not the interests of the people. Turn your book to the opening of chapter 14. It's on page 126. I warned many of you before the class began that this book would probably make you into a vegetarian. Well, if it hasn't already, it probably will in the next few minutes. When you take a bite out of a hamburger, or you take a sip of water, you take a leap of faith. You trust and believe that that product that you're consuming is safe to consume. And part of the reason that you assume that is because somebody somewhere that was qualified took a look at it and said, yes, this is okay, this is grade A quality meat, so not only is it safe to consume, but it'll also probably taste pretty good. That didn't exist in the Gilded Age. As a matter of fact, what we think of as the Food and Drug Administration, or the Department of Agriculture in general, really, didn't exist until well into the 20th century, in the aftermath of books like The Jungle being written. Anyway, because these organizations in government didn't exist, the products that you and I consumed were not always safe, and as a matter of fact, a lot of times were very unsafe to consume. I'll give you the classic example, and we've seen it in our discussions before. Milk wasn't white throughout most of the Gilded Age, it was blue, and the reason it was blue is because all the dairy trusts had doctored it up, and they had pumped chemicals in it so that it would last for longer. Same thing was true of the meat industry. So on page 126, it's at the very top of the page, the beginning of that chapter, they're talking about the conditions in which the meat in which we eat is prepared. With one member trimming beef, that's where I'm beginning. With one member trimming beef in a cannery and another working in a sausage factory, our family had for the first-hand knowledge of the great majority of packing town swindles. For it was custom, as they found, whenever meat was so spoiled that it could not be used for anything else, either to can it or to chop it up into sausage. And think about that next time you bite into a hot dog. With what had been told to them by Jonas, who had worked in the pickle rooms, they could now study the whole of the spoiled meat industry on the inside and read a new and grim meaning into that old packing town jest, that they use everything of the pig except the squeal. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Those things are going into things like sausages and hamburgers. Going further down that page, Jonas had told them how the meat was taken out of the pickle room would often be found sour, and how they would rub it with soda to take away the smell and sell it to be eaten on free lunch counters. In the pickling of hams, they had ingenious apparatus by which they saved time and increased the capacity of the plant. A machine consisting of a hollow needle attached to a pump. By plunging this needle into the meat and working with his foot, a man could fill a ham with pickle in a few seconds. And yet, in spite of this, there would be hams found spoiled, some of them with an odor so bad that a man could hardly bear to be in the room with him. To pump into these frugal packers had a second and much stronger pickle which destroyed the odor, a process known to the workers as giving them 30%. Now, I'm not trying to gross any of you out or turn any of you into vegetarians, but there's some serious issues right there. I mean, forget about the fact that you're eating rotting meat. I mean, that's bad enough. But what about the chemicals that are getting rid of all the stench, which should be your first indication that it's not safe to eat? But what about the chemicals that you're also consuming by eating this bad meat? Where's government? Where's government to say that this is grade A or grade B or grade C or don't eat this? It doesn't exist. Now, let's move beyond the idea of the people that are preparing. This is probably not great for those people to be around those dangerous chemicals, but it's probably even worse for the consumers. We're not talking about nameless and faceless workers like Jurgis. We're talking about suburban middle class, upper middle class people that are eating these things. What rights do you have as a consumer? Shouldn't there be something, some protective organization in government or elsewhere that says, we have standards and anything below this standard is not safe and will not be tolerated? It doesn't exist. It's a clear limitation on freedom. There's a few other examples that I want you to be mindful of. If you go down to that second full paragraph, actually it's the third full paragraph and runs into this page 127, it starts out, it was only when the ham was spoiled that it came into the department of Ona, the wife of Jurgis. Cut up by 2,000 revolutions a minute flyers and mixed with half-ton of other meat, no odor that was ever in a ham could make any difference. And if people all over the world ate the sausage and died of poisoning, the packers would not even have known it. There was never the least attention paid to what was in the cup for sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected and was moldy and white. It would be doused with borax and other chemicals and dumped into the hopper and made over for home consumption. So we're taking Europe's rejects. That's basically what that's saying. And once again, it's another clear-cut example of the government not working for the interests of the people. There's one last example that I want you to be mindful of, that we have time to talk about anyway. It's on page 127. It's toward the bottom of that runoff paragraph. Toward the right-hand side of the stage, the meat would be moldy and white. Do you see that? Look toward the right part of the page. The meat would be moldy and white, stinking and full of maggots, and still cartload after cartload would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and set out to the dear public's breakfasts. Some of it they would make into smoked sausage, but as the smoking took time and was therefore expensive, they would preserve it with borax and color it with gelatine to make it brown. All of their sausage came out of the same bowl, but when they came to pack it, it would stamp some of it, quote-unquote, special, and for this they would charge 2 cents more per pound. So not only are they basically poisoning the American people and getting away with it, they're actually making a profit on it. A handsome profit at that. Now you have to ask yourself, why is this stuff tolerated? Why did people go along with this? Well, if you think about this in the context of our class, it makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we've talked about here is the modern day equivalent of the lobby. People that work for special interest corporations and other entities that are paid to influence politicians and other policymakers. I use the classic example of this in the election of 1896. For those of you that pay attention to that part of the clash, you know that the guy that was running on the Democratic ticket that year was William Jennings Bryan. And one of the things that Bryan wanted to do was restore the power of government to the people. And to do this, he wanted to do things like nationalize, have the government take over the railroads. That's what nationalize means. He wanted to pump more money out there into the American economy so people would spend it. It would dilute the money pool. A lot of people were concerned. He wanted a progressive income tax. So if you're Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller and you made a lot of money, you would pay a lot more taxes. That's the whole idea of a progressive income tax. And Bryan was firmly convinced that if you do these sorts of things, what you're going to do is not only even out the economic playing field in America, but also the political playing field at the same time. Seeing this and the potential that it represented, the potential that the government would essentially be telling them how to run their own factories, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller pulled out all the stops in the election of 1896. Now, neither of them ran directly, but what they did do is they got out their checkbooks. They wrote a check for $250,000 apiece, a lot of money. Back then, it was an enormous sum of money. And they gave it to the guy that was running as the Republican candidate, a guy from Ohio named William McKinley. Now, it just so happened that McKinley said that if you elected him, he would do things to promote a business-friendly environment. And what that was taken to mean was, I will stay out of your factories. I'm not going to tell you how to prepare your meat. I'm not going to tell you how to run your railroads. I'm not going to tell you that you can't monopolize various markets. He's going to have a hands-off approach to the economy. You don't have to be a political scientist to take a good guess as to who won that election. Just like in the 21st century, in the late 19th century, money went a long, long way in terms of influencing votes. William McKinley won that election and won it by an overwhelming margin of victory. And you don't have any reforms throughout his presidency. You don't have any government agencies that are designed to protect consumers. You don't have any new laws that are designed to make a safe working environment. You don't have any laws that are designed to make city governments accountable for having a safe living environment. You don't have anything that we clearly need at the turn of the 20th century. Now, one final example before we break, and that's going to come from your big blue book, your Documents for America's History text. There's a section in this book, and it it takes place in chapter 5. In particular, it's talking about another one of these examples of the government working for the special interests. It's entitled Testimony Before the U.S. Strike Commission on the Pullman Strike of 1894. You can find this on page 73 of your readings. Anyway, if you recall, the Pullman strike involved railroad workers that worked for the Pullman Company. They made these fancy railroad cars. Sleeping cars is really what they were. Anyway, when the workers struck, the owner of the Pullman Company, George C. Pullman, basically called in a favor from the President of the United States, a guy named Grover Cleveland at the time. Now, what he basically said was that these workers, by refusing to handle his cars across state lines, in other words, if there was a train that was pulling a Pullman car and it was going from Missouri west to Kansas, they refused to handle it. What Pullman argued, and successfully so, was that these workers were in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was a law that was designed to prevent people and organizations, predominantly corporations, from restricting interstate trade and interstate travel. In other words, any attempt to stop the flow of goods or people from one state to another would not be tolerated, and the U.S. government would put an end to it. It really wasn't designed to go after workers, but in this case, that's exactly what happened. Grover Cleveland accused the workers of violating the Sherman Antitrust Law. He sent in the National Guards. The National Guards put down the strike. The strike was broken, and the workers lost. They were either forced to go back to work under relatively oppressive conditions or find a new job. It was a classic example of the government working for the special interest, even when it was a law that was designed to take on the special interest wholly and directly. Now, there's a smorgasbord of other examples that you can talk about when it comes to political corruption, the idea of the government working for the special interests. You could certainly make the case that that is what's happening when Jurgis attacks his boss for sexually harassing his wife. There's several other instances in your big blue book of either city governments not living up to their end of the bargain, or examples in my lecture of the corporations sending their own people into Washington or the state governments to take care of their business, literally to take care of their business. I don't necessarily care what examples that you use, or even if you choose to use political corruption, generally speaking, but you do need to understand that this is a very critical time period in American history and American life, because it really threatens our democratic principles, that all men are created equal. Well, if all men are created equal, then why does the government seemingly work for some people and completely fail others? And furthermore, is this an environment where you can not only pursue freedom and happiness, but is it an environment where it's likely that the next generation of Americans can hope for a better life, or that you can rise as far as your talents will take you? And what I'm asking you is, are we really free if this is the situation? And that's a question that you're going to need to come to terms with. But for right now, thank you for watching these video segments. I really do think it's going to make a difference when it comes to writing your papers.